Natasha. So she is an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Her research considers how demographic, social safety net, and economic shifts in the US affect families and children with low incomes. Her research focuses on the living arrangements of children, especially those who live in shared and multi-generation households. Much of her research also considers economic insecurity and how social policies, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, might improve the and life trajectories of children living in poverty. Her research has been supported by the Russell Sage Foundation, the Institute for Research on Poverty, and the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation, among others. Some of her current projects include an evaluation of cash transfer program, several studies of the Earned Income Tax Credit, and a few projects examining employment quality and low wage work. She received her BA in Sociology and Economics from Northwestern University, her Master's of Public Health, Master's of Public Policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and her MA and PhD in Social Welfare Policy from Columbia University's School of Social Work. So we're very honored to have her here today, and I'm really excited to hear. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry, I forgot to also say, so she has requested, so you can always put in questions in the chat, and I'll take a look at them. During the talk, I'll ask her any more clarifying questions, and then after the talk, she's planned 20 minutes to do further in-depth discussion. So thank you, take it away.
Everybody can see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. Before I get started, I just wanted to recognize that this is joint work with Catherine Mitchell-Moore. So she is also to blame. And I also want to thank the Institute for Research on Poverty for their generous support of this research. So I'm going to be talking about the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I know can sound a little bit boring, but hopefully this will still be interesting. And in particular, what this paper does is looks at labor supply and childcare responses to the Earned Income Tax Credit and how that differs by the age of the child. So before I get into the sort of weeds of the paper, I kind of want to give a broad overview of what I'm hoping that you might take away from this. So the first thing is, hopefully you will learn something about the Earned Income Tax Credit. And in fact, it is our largest anti-poverty policy in the US for families with kids. So I'm not sure if everyone really realizes that it's actually a tax credit that's really a hugely important poverty policy. I also want us to think a bit about the implications of our social safety net. So most of our social safety net policies really focus on work and emphasizing movements into work as a way to sort of improve income. But what's sort of lacking often in these sorts of discussions is really thinking about the kids. So who are caring for the children when parents are working, especially in the absence of sort of childcare assistance or childcare policy or even family leave, which we really don't have very much of in the United States. So ultimately, I don't know that I'm going to have the right answer, but I want us to sort of sit and think, or I want to kind of complicate matters for people as we're thinking about this. Are we really doing what's best for kids in these sorts of, and taking these approaches? So not everybody is probably a giant policy wonk like I am that's focused on the poverty safety net. So just to make sure that everyone has a little bit of background. So in the mid-1990s, we had a massive welfare reform. So Bill Clinton really kind of, he said, when he was running for president, kept talking about how he was going to end welfare as we know it. And he actually did, along with a lot of other people. And we had this massive shift in the social safety net and the way in which we provide assistance kind of from this entitlement program. So when we think about welfare in the sort of pre-96 period, it was very focused on if you kind of had low income and you had a child and you were eligible, you could get assistance. And this kind of moves away from that into a much more less cash assistance, much more work contingent. So you have to show that you're working in order to receive assistance, or you're trying to work. And another thing that happens is sort of, I'm sure you've heard this as well, is kind of this emphasis on making work pay. And the way people want to do that is really used through tax credits and using more relief, providing more relief to low income families that are working through the tax credit system. So in 1997, the child tax credit was born. born. If you've been paying any attention to the stimulus package, there's a lot about child tax credits and a lot about, well, a huge, massive reform has happened in that. And I'm happy to talk about that at the end. The other thing that happened, well, so the earned income tax credit was actually implemented in the mid-70s, but in the early 90s, there were several expansions that occurred really around welfare reform to try and help and make it bigger. So just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, this is a picture of federal spending on children by different program types. For those of you in the medical field, you might be interested in the gray bit at the top, that's Medicaid. As you can see, that's actually really gotten very big. But when we think of this as an anti-poverty program, Medicaid doesn't, Medicaid is very helpful to low-income children, but it doesn't raise their income above poverty. We don't think of it in that way because it's not cash to kids. However, if we focus on this very bottom bit, that was what TANF is, what we was our old cash assistance program. It used to be called AFDC. What you can see is that blue bit is getting much smaller over time. So that's basic cash assistance. But what's growing is actually these sort of orangey yellow bits. And this is the child tax credit is the yellow, and the earned income tax credit is the orange. And you can see that that's really been growing over time in terms of our spending on kids. Okay, I already said this. I know that we're talking about taxes and taxes are really boring, but after Social Security, the earned income tax credit lifts more people out of poverty than any other policy in the United States. Okay, this is kind of right. I'm trying to say it's a big deal, right? So this is a figure that I love. I use it every time I'm teaching. It's made by the Census Bureau. And what this does, it's sort of mechanically, essentially takes the income of families and then adds income from different sources and kind of sees who is moved above the poverty line, essentially. So it's a mechanical thing. So don't think of this as an effects slide. But what this is showing us is essentially that Social Security lifts 26 million people out of poverty each year. That's big, right? The next biggest one is actually refundable tax credits, which are the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. They're both lumped in together here. But were we to actually kind of tease these apart, at least in 2019, the earned income tax credit was doing a lot more to lift children out of poverty than child tax credit because of the way it's structured. And again, we can talk about the child tax credit later. But what you can also see here in particular is the colors of the bars. The dark blue are children. So you can see in particular for kids, the earned income tax credit is really helping to lift them out of poverty, or their households out of poverty. So again, if you don't sort of sit and live and breathe all of this, I just kind of want to give a bit more information on background. So beyond the tax credit here in child poverty in the United States, this is what brought me into this field of research. It's really high, especially relative to other countries. We have in 2019, the child poverty rate was one of the lowest we've had since in the last 2 decades. It was still 14.4%, which is quite high. Estimates suggest that in December of 2020, right, with COVID, this is much higher. It's gone back up to about 20% of kids. I mean, the stimulus will actually really change this. But so it's kind of hard to sort of think about it in this context. But the point is a lot of kids live in poverty. The other point that I wanted to make is that young kids are especially likely to live in poverty. And so this is a plot of the poverty rate by age of children over time. And so what you can see is that top line, the green line, are children under the age of 6. So, early childhood poverty is highest. And were we to break this out into different ages, we would see that the infants and toddlers, so the 0 to 2-year-olds, were actually the most likely to live in poverty. They have the highest poverty rates. So one last sort of back thing I kind of want to have going on in the back of your mind, or kind of background, is thinking about this sort of work contingency and the child tax credit, and mothers in particular. So the labor force participation amongst women has been increasing a great deal since the 70s. But in particular, labor force participation rates have increased a great deal amongst mothers. So this is a plot of the labor force participation rate broken out by the age of the child. And the bottom 2 lines show you the pink line is under 3-year-olds, mothers whose youngest child is under the age of 3. The green is mothers with children under the age of 6. And were I to have calculated the slopes and shown it to you here, you would see that they were the steepest. So actually the rate of increase in labor force participation has actually been particularly high amongst mothers with young children. So we came to these research questions because we were really interested in thinking about this bottom group, these moms with young kids, kind of what's going on here, what's driving this increase in the first place, and also are they responding differently, sort of like what's kind of happening to this group. So we are focused on whether the earned income tax credit is more likely to move moms with young kids rather than older kids into the labor force. But the paper looks at all sorts of ages to kind of see, and in a moment, I'll tell you why we were not sure which way this would go. So first of all, there's a long literature that has shown that the earned income tax credit moves single mothers, so mothers who are unmarried, into the labor force. This is like kind of repeatedly been shown. We also know that the earned income tax increases income, not just mechanically by giving you the credit and bringing you above the income, sort of above poverty, but also because people enter the labor force and therefore have more income from earnings, and therefore it reduces poverty. And then sort of more broadly, stepping away from the earned income tax credit, we know that income in early childhood is especially beneficial to kids. So there's been a lot of studies that have shown this, that the sort of long-term effects on kids of early income can be particularly beneficial. And so there have been a number of calls to expand tax credits for families with young children in particular. So both Oregon and California have recently expanded their working tax credits for families with young children. Oregon in particular made it a bigger benefit for families under the age of 3. The new child tax credit that's in the stimulus package is actually also going to provide a bigger benefit for younger kids. Now, the new child tax credit is actually not going to be contingent on work. It's going to function very differently than what I'm talking about today. However, historically, it hadn't, and there were still many calls of interest to kind of say, let's give young families a bigger benefit. But all of this is coming on the idea that we're kind of thinking about, we know families with young kids are more likely to be poor. They're also much more likely to be working these days, but we're trying to think about how can we help reduce poverty, but we haven't really thought about whether or not these policies actually affect different groups differently. And this may have implications for child well-being. So this is what we came to. We were really interested in thinking about, okay, so first we thought early childhood is not that clear what direction this would happen. On the one hand, labor force participation rates are lower amongst mothers with young children. So perhaps if we think about change, there's more margin to move. So that might mean that mothers with very young children are more likely to respond to any sort of policy changes that happen. On the flip side, when you have a young kid, it's harder to kind of work through childcare constraints, and thinking about actually moving into the labor force, you may also have less desire to be in the labor force and may actually be less responsive to any sort of policy changes that we do. We thought that in middle childhood, that it would be more obvious that as children transition to the school age, there are fewer childcare constraints, and mothers might be more likely to work. And then lastly, we thought for adolescent mothers that actually this would probably not have as much of an effect, in part because a policy change that happens when you already have an adolescent, you're probably already in the labor force if you're going to be in the labor force, or the reasons that you're not in the labor force might not be things that are that movable. Like say perhaps you have a health constraint or your child has a health constraint, things that might not actually influence your decision to work. Okay, so what are the research questions? I've done a lot of talking about background. We're going to specifically look at whether or not the age of the child affects mother's labor supply response by saying the response to changes in the earned income tax credit. So we're going to look at these different outcomes. And then I haven't talked about this yet really, but I will later in more detail, is sort of who's taking care of children when moms go to work. So we're also going to look at whether or not the earned income tax credit affects the use of childcare in terms of hours and spending, as well as the types of arrangements that moms are moving into, not moms, their children are moving into. So just to give you a little preview of the results, we find that actually it's mothers with young children who are the most responsive to any sort of policy expansions to the EITC. So mothers with children under the age of 6 in general, but in particular, mothers with children whose age under the age of 2. So it's especially moving moms with infants and toddlers into the labor force. And then when we look at the effects on childcare, we find that overall childcare uses increases as one might expect, but then the use of both informal and formal childcare increases in response to expansions, but informal care increases twice as much as formal care. And if you know anything about the childcare literatures, formal care is linked with more positive outcomes for kids than informal childcare. Okay. Should I take a pause here? Do we have any questions?
Nothing has showed up in the chat
Okay.
yet. That was a great overview. So I appreciate your going through that because I just learned a lot.
Okay. So I'm going to go even into more depth about the earned income tax credit so that you can understand why we expect these things to have, why would we even expect the earned income tax credit to have an effect on employment? So as I mentioned already, the earned income tax credit was started in the 70s. It serves 26 million households each year. It costs about $66 billion. The maximum earned income tax credit for a family of 3 kids is a little bit over $6,000. However, on average, households with kids get about $3,000. There is an earned income tax credit for people who do not have children. I am not going to be concerned with them. I'm not going to include them in these analyses. That said, there's another big reform that just happened in the stimulus plan to help those households as well, which again, I'm happy to talk about at the end. So what is it, the earned income tax? It's a fully refundable tax credit that's targeted at low-income households. There are no lifetime limits. I say this because a lot of our public assistance, not a lot, TANF has our welfare program has a lifetime limit. You can't get it for more than 5 years. That's not true for this. It works like every other tax. You pay, it's based on your prior year's earnings. Households with income up to about 225% of the federal poverty line get it. So you get a tax refund, even if you don't have tax liability. That's what makes this different from other taxes. So I want to just kind of going to be a little bit pedantic for a moment here. The refundable aspect of the tax credit is really crucial to alleviating poverty because it basically acts as like an annual cash transfer to households that are earning income, but that is not very high. So what do I mean by the refundable bit? So even let's say I earned $10,000 and I paid $2,000 in taxes. And a normal deductible, a tax deduction, I might be able to say, oh, I have a kid and I take a deduction of $1,000 or $2,000, and that might bring me down to zero. So you might get the money you already paid the government back, but that's not refundable. That's just you're getting it back because you took deductions. The refundable tax credit, so for especially if you have a low income, you probably don't actually owe the government any money. You probably haven't even paid the government any money. But even if you have a zero tax liability, you will then actually still get money back. And on average, people are getting back about $3,000 a year. So that's the piece that's refundable. The only refundable tax credits we have right now are the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. Everything else are just tax deductions. So it kind of reduces your tax liability. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to use all of these changes that happen to the earned income tax credit over time to kind of try and estimate our models. Since 1975, there have been a number of different federal expansions. So there have been increases in the phase-in rate. There's a bunch of little sort of technical things that you probably don't care about, but I'll explain it to you in a second. But basically, there's been a number of changes that we're going to leverage to try and estimate causal effects. The other thing we're going to use is we're going to use state earned income tax credits. So 29 states have earned income tax credits. The way they're done is they're essentially a % of the federal benefit, and they vary wildly in how generous they are. So some states only have a tax credit that's 3.5% of the federal, and the most generous one is almost 85%. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that, but it's California and it's very, very generous. And the states started coming online in terms of offering EITCs in the mid 80s. And California only actually started offering a credit in 2015. So there's actually been a lot of variation that we have in terms of states deciding to offer earned income tax credits, and kind of when they do this, they also get more generous over time. A lot of states do, and some states, like Michigan, get less generous over time. And so we're going to use those changes also to try and estimate our effects. This is a map that shows you the states that have earned income tax credits. The blue ones are refundable. The orange ones are not refundable. So that just means it would reduce your tax liability. It's not going to give you the money back. And what you can see is there's a lot of variation in terms of the types of places that actually offer EITCs. It's not so consistently just the like coasts, right? We actually have, Louisiana offers a credit. Oklahoma has had one for a while, even though it's not refundable. California is more recent, and so forth. Okay, so why would I even expect the earned income tax credit to affect anything really in terms of work besides it's just cash? So this is the structure of the earned income tax credit. We call this the trapezoidal structure. So what you can see here on the x-axis is income, so the income that you have from earnings, and on the y-axis we have the amount of the credit that you're getting. So we'll ignore this little baby bump at the bottom. That's the child, we called it the childless tax credit, but it's the tax credit where if you don't have a child that lives in your household. That's the one that's just been massively expanded. So if we focus on the top line, each line is actually for the number of kids that you have. So 1, 2, or 3 children, the top line is for 3 kids. So this sort of ramp up, we call it the phase in, you'll see that the slope of the line is pretty steep. The idea here is that as you earn income, you can earn a bigger credit. So the idea here is the incentive is actually, it's good for you. Both you can earn more income and you can get a larger credit. And then we reach with sort of the flat piece, which is the plateau. And here, unlike a lot of other public assistance programs, which have these cliffs where essentially you become ineligible for programs really quite quickly, here we're saying you can continue to earn more income or work more hours and you won't lose your benefit. Again, this is part of the idea that this is structured to encourage work. And then the phase out rate, these sorts of the slope of this line is not as steep as the phase in. Why is this? This is again the idea that we don't want people to be losing the resources that they're gaining from the earned income tax credit by working more. But there's it's set up so that as you get more income from earnings, you have a loss in your earned income tax credit, but it's not that it's bigger. It's still worth it to basically have greater earnings. I can see that there's maybe been a question in the chat. I don't know. I got a little alert.
Question is, this is federal only, so for some states this could be almost double.
So for states, it's never really double. It's almost always just a tiny bit. So on average, I don't know what the average state amount would be off the top of my head, but like 10 to 12 to 15% of the federal credit. So no one is at 100% of the credit, and even California, which is extremely generous, it's only 85% for certain subgroups of people who are then it's kind of complicated the way California set it up. So no, they're not that generous, but they're adding more money on. So okay. So what are we doing in our study? I'm going to go over the methods and data, but I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this. We're going to use the current population survey, the March supplement. It's a nationally representative sample of about 60,000 households a year. We're going to focus on survey years 1990 to 2017, which is tax years 89 to 2016. And I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but we're going to particularly look at unmarried mothers, and we're going to look at unmarried mothers without a college education who have at least one child in the household, and our sample is going to be 150,000 households. So why are we looking at unmarried mothers? Well, 60% of the people who receive the earned income tax credit are unmarried mothers. One, and two, and why are we focusing on those who don't have college educations? Well, those with college educations are not very likely to receive the earned income tax credit. And what we're trying to do is essentially select a population of people that we think are going to be exposed to, who are going to be exposed to these changes in the credit over time, who are likely to actually be able to respond to the tax credit. We're going to focus on the youngest child in the household, and we're going to include controls for ages of the other children in the household. We have done this a million ways, and they're really pretty robust to whatever kind of way we specify age in particular. So in an ideal world, we would be able to randomly assign larger credits to some households and compare outcomes to those who received it and who didn't, right? This is sort of the thought exercise. We can't do that in practice and the EITC benefits are not randomly assigned. And eligibility for the credit is actually correlated with the age of the child and your likelihood of working. So what are we going to do instead? We're going to do what is called a parameterized difference in difference model. So maybe you've heard of it, difference in difference. Basically what we're doing is we're going to actually include all of those different variation and changes, many changes, not just one change, pre and post. We're going to be able to sort of include other stuff like the states getting more and less generous. And what we're going to do is, so states are going to come online, the federal benefit's going to get more generous. It's going to vary by the number of children in the household. I'll show you that in a second. So essentially, we're going to exploit variation across time, across states, and across family size. What we're doing is calculating the average household credit in each state. So kind of what would we expect you, if you were a mother with one child in Alabama in 1992, what's the average credit that you would be exposed to? We are not using the mom's own EITC. I actually recently reviewed a paper for pediatrics, was on the earned income tax credit, and one of the other reviewers got really mad at the authors for not using one's own EITC. But I was really pro that because because it's endogenous to so many decisions. What you want to see is you're going to see kind of average population changes when they're exposed to different levels of the policy. So this is going to be able to give us a better kind of causal effect. This is very common in the Medicaid literatures as well, which may be something that more of you are familiar with. So the federal policy changes that have occurred sort of over this time period in our study, this just plots the average benefit level for families with 1 kid, 2 children, or 3 or more children. What you can see is in the early period, the difference between having 1, 2, or 3 kids, you didn't get a bigger credit. And then in the 90s, they made a change so that people with 2 or more kids could get a larger credit. In 2009, there was another policy change so that families with 3 or more children would get an even larger credit. So that's going to be where a lot of our variation is going to come from. But because we also have all these state changes, I like to call this the spaghetti soup, which is essentially all of this sort of noisy mess. You can't see it at all, but this is because it's got both the federal change as well as all of the states that come on. And as they come on, you can kind of see those big lines pop up. And as they start to offer them, or sometimes actually pull back on their earned income tax credits. Bottom line, what I want you to take away is that we have a lot of changes to use to see basically if this policy does anything. Okay, how do we get to the simulated credit? We use another data set and we do some stuff, and I'm going to pass on because I don't think anyone needs to. I mean, I'm happy to go into those details if you want to, but it's kind of boring. And this is also the math, which is also sort of boring. Basically, what I want you to know is that we have state, year, and number of child fixed effects in our models. We control for a lot of contextual factors. So state year factors like the unemployment rate. We're also going to account for things like the monthly welfare benefits, because you might be concerned that there are a lot of changes that are happening around welfare also at the same time. We're going to try and make sure that in the paper, we go into this in a lot more detail to sort of make sure that you believe that what we're trying to isolate is really the effect of the earned income tax credit. We're also going to do a lot of robustness checks. Again, I'm not going to show you all of this, but I kind of want to walk through a few of them. So I'm going to show you models that interact the child's age and show you those point estimates. But we can also stratify by age and we get a similar sort of set of results. We include a lot of different time trends. We replicate this in what we call this a placebo test. So remember how I said we're not going to include college educated women in our analyses. We can actually just look at the earned income tax credit effects on that group in particular. And we would expect to not see anything, and we don't see anything because this is a group of people who on average aren't going to be exposed or aren't going to be affected by policy changes that are happening. We replicate this by separating the federal and the state EITCs. This is also going to help us reduce concerns about federal welfare reform policies. We can do this for all children in the households. We can do this for a traditional difference in difference, which is what we often do, which is often done in this literature. Anyway, I replicated these findings in another data set, the American Community Survey. It stays. Okay, now I'm going to actually tell you what we find. How am I doing on time? Okay. Finally, 30 minutes in, I get you to the results. So these are on the left-hand side, I have work, so employment, and then full-time employment. And full-time employment is working 35 hours or more. So what are these showing you? So this 8.9, this is saying that a $1,000 increase in the earned income tax credit is linked with an almost 9 percentage point increase in the likelihood of working for mothers whose youngest child are ages 0 to 2. So the 0 to 2 is the sort of green bar, 3 to 5 is next to it, then 6 to 12, and the 13 to 17-year-olds. So you still see that there's a positive sort of direction, positive association on the main effect for working, but that when we look at these interactions, it's actually really these young kids that are the ones that are more likely to be moving into the labor force as compared to the moms with older kids. So I just said that. But what I want you to say, what does this really mean? So it's saying that a $1,000 increase moves many more mothers with young infants and toddlers and preschoolers into the labor force than mothers of adolescents. So what is this in terms of effect sizes? So the average employment for mothers whose children are ages 0 to 2 is 48%. A 9 percentage point increase is a nearly 20% increase in employment amongst this group. For those of you who don't live in for those of us who don't live in the medical science world, so I can't say if this is a big effect size in medicine, but for policy people, this is a really big effect size. In comparison, for the mothers of adolescents, we see a 7% increase in employment. So if we were to look at earnings, These are in thousands of dollars. So this 2.4 is $2,400 a year more in earnings. We continue to see the same pattern, right? And that's probably not surprising since these are the people who are moving into the labor force. They also have the greatest increase in earnings. They are also more likely to be working more hours on average. Again, you know, these are all sort of the same consistent story. The biggest effects are for the youngest kids. I find this actually quite compelling or interesting. This is the same thing, but here we're looking at poverty. So people being lifted out of poverty. This does not include the earned income tax credit itself, right? So we don't add the average amount that people are getting back in. This is just without that. So this is based on sort of employment effects. What we can see here is that so what is extreme poverty? Extreme poverty is half of the poverty rate. So 50% of poverty, this is really not very much money. You know, so for a family of, a single person is about $11,000. So half of that, right? It's not a lot of money, but so we're lifting a lot of people above that threshold. Okay. But then if we look at people actually being lifted above poverty, we see that we actually are lifting quite a lot of families with young kids out of poverty just through the earned income tax credit. I mean, through these expansions. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, these are all buckets, 0 to 2. What if a 0 to 1-year-old is different from a 1 to 2-year-old? So we can actually do a sort of fully interacted model where we break it out by all ages. So first, this is just, this is both plotting a cubic and a fully interactive model. The fully interacted model is the sort of beige colored one. It's kind of hard to see. And what those lines are the confidence intervals. So the dotted line that's a straight line is the average effect. So if we don't take into account the age of the child, we see that mothers are about 6 percentage points more likely to enter the labor force. But what you can really see here is that it is, you know, that it's really coming, that there's this sort of the very clear sort of decline that's happening over time as children age. On the very right-hand side of this graph, you can see the confidence intervals are very large. We don't have a lot of data to support sort of the 17 and 18-year-old moms. So I wouldn't read much into that kind of uptick. Okay, so what? Is this good or is this bad, right? So increasing income is clearly good. Reducing poverty in early childhood has long-term effects. I think that is a positive outcome. I would say increasing employment for moms with very young kids is, I don't know that we know what the answer is to that. So the research on effects on kids is really mixed. It's kind of all over the place. I would say that on average, there's basically very little causal research in this realm, but I would say that on average, what we find is that for lower income households, the association is positive, more positive. There are bigger benefits for low income kids for maternal employment than for higher income kids. But a lot of this literature has become much more interested in thinking about the counterfactual. So where is it that the children are going when they aren't with their parents? There's some recent research on Norway in particular that found, you know, looking at very early childhood employment, and they find, the only times it's not great is when the kids are not going into sort of formal center-based care. So I do think we want to think about that in our context as well. So that's what's going to kind of prompt this next research question, which is sort of who do we see that are caring for our children when we're moving these unmarried mothers into work? So maybe I should take another pause. I'll keep that. Okay.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes,
when you said,
please.
like, on your last slide, just talking about the positive effects, what can you give me like a broad understanding of what you mean by positive effects? That makes sense.
I mean, so it is, yeah. So increased income in early childhood is associated with sort of long-term well-being in terms of economic well-being, better high school graduation rates, more college going in the long term, but in the shorter term, kids are much more likely they have higher kind of school readiness, better sort of academic outcomes. I don't know the health literature as much on this side of things. Actually, I don't know how much people have, those of us who are sort of sit in this tend to look at kind of socio-emotional and kind of, verbal math kind of outcomes for cognitive stuff.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to just give a little tiny background. I'll be short on the background on childcare. So there are a number of different kind of issues when we think about childcare in the United States. So the availability of childcare is, for anybody who has a child knows, it's hard to get childcare. It's expensive as well. So sort of high quality childcare for those under the age of 3 is especially limited. So, I mean, I can remember when I was looking for care for my kid at sort of even like 2.5, 3, the sort of availability of childcare center sort of arrangements that become much more prevalent, in part because of how much the staffing needs, right? So it's much harder to take care of infants. The other thing you should know is that public assistance is especially limited. So about 1 in 4 people who would be income eligible for assistance actually receives assistance. And infant care, you know, is especially expensive, especially as compared to, say, like a preschool aged child. And center-based care on average, so there's, you know, a little bit of mixed findings in some of this literature, but I'd say on average center-based care is linked with sort of better outcomes for kids, like school readiness, as compared to informal care. And when I say informal care, I mean if you were being cared for by a relative or a family daycare center. So what's a family daycare centers are confusingly named. These are where maybe somebody runs a childcare center in their home and maybe takes like care of 3 or 4 children. Versus the more center-based care where you might have a set of 20 children and a number of different staff. Also, there are staffing problems too. We have a shortage of people who, well, we don't pay very well in the childcare setting either. So sort of what does this look like in the United States? So I'm actually going to switch to a different data set. I'm not going to go into the details here. It's the Survey of Income and Program Participation, but this is a data set that actually has information on childcare. And this just gives you a sense of what kind of childcare children are in at these 2 different age groups. And of course, children who are older than 5 are also in care, but we're not going to focus on them because a lot of them are in school, and kind of the after school care setting is really different. So here you can see that a lot of children are in informal care. When they're very young, they're quite unlikely to be in center-based care. Some of you may be thinking, well, what about Head Start? Head Start, typically there's sort of 2 types of Head Start. There's Head Start, which is largely for 4-year-olds. So this is the Head Start is for low-income kids. Again, there are far fewer slots. I believe the number is about 1 in 2 available for the number relative to the number of kids who actually need it. And then we have what's called early Head Start, which is the 0 to 3-year-olds, and that's really, really limited in terms of availability. Okay, so what do we find? So we see that there's a significant increase in the use of childcare across all of the different outcomes that we look at for children ages 0 to 2. We do not see any change for children ages 3 to 5 in response to the earned income tax credit, even though, as I showed you, there is a labor supply response. We don't see anything in terms of changes in childcare. That may be that people are still putting kids in care regardless of sort of employment. And these are really large point estimates. So we think they're too big. I would say kind of take them as a direction of the association rather than necessarily kind of precise estimates of the magnitude. And so what you can see here is that their kids are more likely to be in childcare, and their moms report being more likely to pay for childcare in response to expansions. But I think what's kind of the most interesting piece here is that while we see an increase in the use of center-based care, it's twice as big in terms of the use of informal care. So people are much more likely to be putting mothers are more likely to be putting their children into informal care, and twice as likely. We also look at the number of hours of care. I don't plot them on here, but you can see there's an increase in hours of about, again, I'm not sure if the estimate is exactly precise, but roughly 9 hours. So some of this is a cost problem, right? So the earned income tax credit, is it even worth it? So if it increases spending on childcare it increases spending by about 120%, which is equal to about $1,100 a year. We know that the average increase in income from the earned income tax credit itself is $2,400 a year. So almost half of this increase in income that I've been saying is a good thing is being removed by the cost of childcare. But we also have to think about why the sort of informal and formal childcare. So if you look at informal childcare arrangements, only 1 in 3 moms actually pay for it, right? So maybe you're sending your kid to go be with grandma, and grandma doesn't charge you for that. But if you are charged, the average cost is about $320 a month. However, in comparison, when we look at center-based care, 75% of the mothers reported making payments for center-based care. And among those who pay, it's about $400 a month. So the costs are pretty similar, except that many more people in center-based care are paying for it. Well, who are the quarter of people who aren't paying for center-based care? That's probably largely Head Start, or they may be receiving childcare subsidies, because we do provide childcare subsidies. So this means that if we were to calculate this out, basically center-based care costs an average of $3,300 a year, as compared to $1,200 a year for informal care. You can do the math pretty simply. If you're only making $2,400 more, it just doesn't make sense to send your children to center-based care, cost-wise. So, what are we taking away from this? Kids are much more likely to be in formal care, maybe I'm saying less good. I don't want to make very strong statements about this because obviously there's a lot of heterogeneity in informal care. I'm sure that my mother would be very upset if I said she wasn't very good at taking care of my kid. But the costs also just mean that it doesn't make sense for mom. There's no, we're thinking about incentives. If I want to be, I'm not an economist, but if I want to be an economist, right, we're thinking about kind of what we're sort of incentivizing. We can't actually ask mothers to put their children in center-based care given the costs. So what we're doing is we're moving moms into work and maybe moving kids into middling kind of care. Oops, wrong direction. So, as I mentioned, we're one of only a handful of countries. No, I didn't mention this. We are one of only a handful of countries who have no paid parental leave, in particular maternity leave. The Federal Medical Leave Act only covers some jobs. It's not paid. So when we're thinking about this sort of first year of life, we are just not in this game in terms of policies in the United States. Okay, a few states have paid leave, but there's not very many of them. And then in terms of childcare policies, what we offer is really limited assistance and limited payments. And, as I mentioned already, the Head Start doesn't have as many, there's so many more children that are eligible for Head Start than have funded slots. But it's even hard to think about expansions to this because we don't have enough staffing. And we pay so poorly that people don't really want to enter this field. And so all of this is really hard. I think we need to be doing a lot of critical thinking about childcare. So I think this is my last slide. So kind of what's the bottom line? I have to be honest, I don't know what the right answer is. And this paper was one of these things that I find very kind of unsatisfying, and maybe hopefully it's not too unsatisfying to hear me talk about this, but I think that more income and less poverty is definitely good. It's good for kids. Also, when we think about, we know from other research also that when you move into the labor force, there's earnings growth, right? That happens over time. So as you're in the labor force longer, you're more likely to earn more. So there's sort of this positive benefit that grows kind of over time. But when we're thinking about these very young kids, maybe we want to have this happen a little bit later in time with some other policies in place for very young kids. It's not clear because many infants and toddlers are going into this sort of informal care that might be associated with sort of less good outcomes. And I think what might be happening is that we're dampening any positive effects of these early incomes over time by having all these kids go into these childcare arrangements that might not be really as beneficial to them kind of in the long term. That said, there's research looking at the effects of the earned income tax credit on long-term outcomes. And I forget, my co-author on this paper has an estimate, and I forgot the exact number, but it's something like $50,000 of additional income over the life course of a child if you get the earned income tax credit for 15 years. So it's actually kind of a lot of money, right? But and there are research that shows effects on positive effects on kids. I think what we might think is kind of, would these effects be even more positive were we to have some kind of different infrastructure around childcare in particular, and or early parental leave. Okay, that's it. If you want to read the paper, it is available online and it's forthcoming in the Journal of Labor Economics. There's a lot of more tables, which are largely quite boring.
Thank you very much. People can either feel free to chime. It may be easiest to put the questions in the chat, but you can also chime in if you would like.
Sharing, so you don't have to.
Perfect. Do you have any thoughts on what the answer would be for early child care? Like,
like a solution?
Yeah.
More of it? No, I don't. I mean, I wish I did. Yeah.
Natasha, thanks for such an excellent talk. And this is really fascinating research. And like you, I'm just stuck with the finding that, there is this great support to help mothers move into the workforce, but the child care solutions are not there. So I was really curious to hear that there are some states that provide paid leave. Do you know which ones they are? It's not Michigan,
Yeah.
at least that's a start, because we know, how things typically happen in this country is that if there are some successful pilot programs at the state level, that's often a path towards a federal program.
Yeah, so California has one and has had one for quite a long time. New Jersey has one as well. I think there's a third state that I'm blanking on that has one as well. I haven't gotten to that part of my syllabus where I refresh my mind about these topics. I know those two for sure. Yeah.
And I just want to restate, I know you were even more generous to our country than needed by saying, we're only a handful of countries. As far as I know, we are the only industrialized country that does not have any kind of paid parental leave.
Yeah, it's like us and Papua New Guinea.
Okay.
I think there might be one other country, but yeah. No, and especially maternity leave, right? So not all countries offer paternity leave, but pretty much everywhere does maternity leave. And the effects are pretty clear about, but you said, so there are actually a lot of studies in the California paid leave, just to sort of, the problem is getting data on kids and kids' outcomes is actually hard. We don't do a very good job of collecting data. And so we know more about paid leave and sort of long-term, labor force attachment and income because we can get those from sort of tax records. But we actually don't know a great deal yet, I think, in terms of kids in the US.
I haven't formulated even exactly what this question is, but, as a parent of young children during the pandemic, I'm struck with how bizarre childcare has been over the last year for many of us. And I don't know if I can't even think of a way, but, to leverage this very large natural experiment to answer any of these questions about what works and doesn't. And the childcare problems have been scattered over people with many different life circumstances, I think, unlike maybe previously. So I don't know if there's what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I don't want to sell myself as a childcare expert. This is not really where I do my research, right? So I'm looking at childcare as an outcome, but really I'm an earned income tax credit. I know this seems like I shouldn't be that distinct, but I don't know a great deal about it.
I think it's because we're all thinking about childcare all the time right now. You're right. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I know a little bit about childcare, but I really don't know enough about, especially what's going on now, to even have a smart answer to that. But I do see there's a question in the chat. Is there any estimate of what the cost of a 12-month parental leave would be and how this would offset some other costs related to some of these data we presented? So that's a great question. So none of the US states that offer 12 months. I mean, that's nutty. We're talking 3 months. So, but I mean, so there's a lot of research on Europe and their family leave policies, and there's debate on kind of what's the optimal length of a family leave. So, and actually maybe 3 months is great or is good. 3 months is good. Let's go there. I'm not going to make a statement about 3 versus 12. So the way California taxes just adds a tax. It's to your earnings, and it's not very big. So one of these things, there's a sort of pushback on people without children, not wanting to pay for people with children. It's something like $1. Don't quote me on this exactly because I don't know the numbers, but it's not very big. So it's actually, I think it would be pretty easy to actually fund this because not everyone is most people will probably become parents at some point, but it's not everybody at one time, right? So I don't think this would be challenging.
I have a question about two questions. One is, it seems really suboptimal to kind of make all these tax credits come as a bolus at one time. And I know that I think the stimulus is going to try to spread the child tax credit at least out in monthly payments. Yeah. I'm just wondering if that could just be part of permanent policy in general for it, because it seems, or I guess maybe the question is there empirical research supporting the idea that if you kind of spread an income out over time, that certainty actually has value beyond the actual net kind of content of the level of earnings. And so I'll actually, let me get my second question after that.
Okay, I have a lot to say about this. So, I'm currently studying cash transfers in particular, and so this literature is not settled in terms of the periodicity of cash. There are suggestions that so they do different things. So regular cash provides you with it's kind of a consumption smoothing. So you see that regular cash is usually associated with greater like food spending, bill paying, those sorts of things. The lump sum nature though of the earned income tax credit is beloved. Why is that? People kind of use it to pay for bigger things. So I have some work that looks at housing. So people, things like having to pay a deposit on a house, people like to use it to pay off their cars. It's kind of, we call it a forced savings mechanism. So there are a lot of people who report really liking that. So it's not so clear what people want or need. That said, the earned income tax credit up until 2010 you were allowed to take it on a monthly basis. However, the way the system was set up was that you had to go to your employer and negotiate it with your employer to sort of set the system up. And so I think that there was some stigma around that. And so only something like 10% of people actually took the credit in that way. They always did the lump sum. And so we removed that policy because it was kind of an administrative burden that people thought wasn't worth it. But you're right that the new tax credit is supposed to come. I think in the bill, it's like periodically. I know that originally the idea has been monthly, and the child benefit policies in Europe are all monthly. And there has had really big effects on child poverty and certainly sort of well-being. So I think, I don't know what the answer is in terms of like which has bigger bang for the kind of child well-being overall, if it's the same amount of money. But I think that we're still trying to figure that out, frankly. You had another question though.
I did, which is this idea that we have a lot of policy that's contingent upon having a child, right? Obviously, the child tax credit is only given to people who have children, which I guess is okay if your goal is to lift people out of child poverty. But if your goal is to just to solve child poverty, if you want to solve poverty, then things like the expansions of the EITC to households without children would be more appropriate. And I'm just wondering, it just goes back to this idea of a universal basic income, I guess, right? Really, if you make something contingent upon having a child, you could have unintended consequences with that. You could have, you could kind of erode the political support for it because people might say, well, I don't have a child. It just seems like there's something more broad-based that is not contingent on having a child might be better policy, but I'm sure.
Well, yeah. So I'm going to say we, the United States, don't like to give money to people who aren't working. So there's a very strong and pushback on any policy that is not contingent on work. So, if you are an adult who is not in the labor force, we kind of, this is not my feelings, right? But there's sort of the distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And so most of our policies are, right, so they're both contingent on having a child and contingent on work. So I think there's sort of two pieces, right? We do actually provide assistance to families with children, but I think that that's because we think that kids are deserving and that through no fault of their own, that they are poor, but we don't tend to want to provide support to the mothers of these children. So for instance, right, the new tax benefit also actually extends Medicaid through for postpartum for a year, right? Whereas it was only 60 days before that. So this is sort of a shift in kind of, so I often think that we tend to actually disentangle kids from their parents, and we don't think the parents deserve support ever. So it's like no adults deserve support unless you're working. That said, again, the stimulus package actually just provided a tripling of the earned income tax credit for families without kids. And this is a huge deal. And I actually just wrote a little policy brief that should be coming out today on this. It's going to reduce poverty for 17 million people. It's actually going to do more. it's going to move more adult people out of poverty than this reform for the child tax credit, which I frankly care more about because I study kids. But again, like this is new. It's not the same thing as like a universal basic income. The universal basic income is very hard to think through. It's never been really universal. Hardly anyone's actually making a universal proposal. Most people are sort of doing still targeted proposals, right? Because they don't want to give rich people. I mean, it's complicated. We don't really know what would happen if we did it universally. I'm not saying I'm not pro or con that. I think it's just really complicated and hard to think through. And most of the policies that do suggest universal income also suggest taking away all other public assistance programs. And so that to fund it. And then that becomes complicated in a lot of different ways. Like if we remove Medicaid and we remove Social Security and we remove Medicare, what is that going to mean? You know, is $1,000 a month going to be enough to replace those? Probably not. So yeah. So anyway, so it's the particular policy matters. But you're right. I don't think it's the correct thing that we only focus on families of kids. I think we should be worrying about the adults as well who don't have children.
It feels also that it's really interesting some of the way that the framing of the stimulus has been about lifting people out of poverty. I mean, in a sense, it's like poverty level is really low, right? And so if you're tripling this EITC for kind of family households without children, you might be giving them a couple $1,000, right, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So you're making them go from an income of, I don't know, 17,000 to 20,000. So technically you've lifted them out of poverty, but I mean, it's almost like a false, it's a false outcome, right? Because that's, you know, it just means you've kind of increased people's beyond the thresholds of which we define as poverty. So, you know, that's kind of, I mean, I'm not against this, don't get me wrong. I'm all for it. I think it's the way that it's being framed is a little bit disingenuous.
Right. So you're pointing to the critiques that the poverty line is too low, and that is true. Also, people still struggle even if they're right above. In fact, most of our post-social assistance programs don't do the cutoff at 100% of poverty. Medicaid is up to 138% of poverty at a minimum, and many states go much higher up the income distribution. And so, not like I guess Medicaid for families with kids. So yeah, it's that's a different. I mean, yes, I agree. I don't know about the framing of it. I mean, that's politics.
Yeah.
Susan, did you have a question? I couldn't tell if you raised your hand.
Oh, I didn't, but I did have a question, a very quick one. You mentioned that it was a fabulous presentation, and you mentioned that only 1 in 4 people who qualify for subsidies actually get it. I think that's something you said.
For childcare subsidies, yeah.
For child, why is that?
Money. We don't put enough money into it. This is true for all of our public assistance, like housing assistance, except for, so we have 2 different funding mechanisms, right? So when something's an entitlement, we put money behind it. The only program that we have that's an entitlement, really, I mean, there are others, but in this realm are food stamps. But for everything else, you actually have to budget for it. So the Congress has to actually make a budget and then give it to the housing authority or give it to the people who Head Start, which is run through the Administration for Children and Families. And they don't allocate enough money for it.
Astounding. So that might be a good first step to get money for the things that they already qualify for.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we don't have time for my other question, which was more about the differences of impact by race and zip code. But I think we're out of time, so I may have to email with you on that.
Well, I mean, if people can, I can stay on for 1 more minute, certainly. We haven't looked at, so on average, actually, there's interestingly for the earned income tax credit, variation across racial groups is quite similar in terms of, there's very little variation in terms of receipts. So although in general, like Black and Hispanic families are more likely to be in the lower end of the income distribution, sort of contingent on that, the receipt of the credit and the amount of the credit is really similar. That said, it is going to help. Any expansions that occur are going to sort of disproportionately help non-white families essentially, and to sort of in terms of helping kind of boost incomes. That said, Kathy and I have put in a grant to do some research on this in particular, to do more around the childcare piece, because I think that gets a little bit more complicated. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a great talk, and I know I learned a whole lot that I really didn't know. So thanks for educating me on policy and some economics as well. So we really enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great rest of
Thanks so much. That was fantastic. Thanks. Have a great day.